Last year I published a video that later appeared as an expanded article about the scandal of whiteness theory in psychoanalysis. I was provoked by an article published by Donald Moss in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association called On Having Whiteness. In that article, he boldly went where no man has gone before, in claiming that white babies are born with a pathological parasitic affliction to hate, oppress, abuse, and dominate all other races that are not white. Now, how could this possibly happen? It sounds like a spoof, but it happened. This nonsense that was published in a premier psychoanalytic journal is simply unbelievable until you lay your eyes on it. In fact, it is so jarring that you have to question your grip on reality until you read it. The thought that a baby can be born racist, that is predetermined to abhor, feel superior to, and vanquish any non-white race after hitting the hospital delivery table, is so supercilious and so obscene that it brought international disgrace on the profession by a woke editor who allowed a non-peer-reviewed article to see the light of day. It is no coincidence that they are friends. It's also not surprising that Moss received death threats after his article was published, and the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute received bomb threats where Moss is affiliated, the original psychoanalytic training organization established by the American Psychoanalytic Association. It goes without saying that no one should be terrorized by such intimidations simply for voicing their ideas, as words alone should not determine life or death. And in no way should anyone condone such draconian practices in a free society. But this scandal ran its course in social media and unfortunately in Moss's personal life. Tucker Carlson even made a parody of Moss and Japa on Fox News. Yet this caricature incited the public, including the rage and paranoid fears of white supremacists. By claiming that white babies are racist parasites, itself a racist slur, Moss undermines the very anti-racism principles he wants to uphold. When he adopts anti-white sentiment as a means to oppress racism, he is feeding into populism and those whose political agendas are most suspicious of, if not antagonistic towards, social justice initiatives. Such inflammatory statements actually enable the influential media personality Carlson to promote his bullhorn racism, conspiracy theories, and white nationalism, hence justifying his depiction of white grievance as being merely a reaction to anti-white racism. But this also invites the public in general to discredit the entire profession of psychoanalysis that would support the publication of anti-white dogma. And here we are left with the shame of this indiscretion that continues to hurt the profession. Speaking of professionalism, around this time I joined the Division 39 Forum, an unmoderated listserv which belongs to the Psychoanalytic Division of the American Psychological Association, and was surprised to see the extreme political views that were being promulgated by critical social justice advocates, including the notion posted by one member that professionalism is governed by, quote, white supremacy ideology. When I asked this member to explain herself, I was immediately contacted by a committee chair from the division edifying me that this person is black and I should issue an apology. Given I don't believe in identity politics, nor do I need the woke police telling me how to think or act, I naturally replied with my own critique. And as you might guess, I was called a white supremacist and a, quote, conservative, white, heteronormative cis man, despite being a liberal from Canada. I was further accused of pseudo-intellectual posturing, where I was, quote, mansplaining and white-splaining intellectual and philosophical concepts, end quote, and then simply dismissed as, quote, an old white man on a public professional listserv of over 1,600 people. And yes, she has a PhD. Does it not occur to her and others that this is blatant racism and sexism? But of course not, as she specifically told us, because she's black. Now, about the same time, another person on the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy membership listserv, a moderated list, unlike the Division 39 forum, posted a comment that I espouse, quote, anti-black racism, to which IARP issued an immediate apology for allowing the post to go through accidentally. Let's fast forward to now. I recently offered to debate these ideas about white supremacy in society, racism, whiteness, professionalism, and so forth at the upcoming Division 39 conference to be held in 2023. But after someone took me up on my challenge, she backed out, claiming it had become too politicized after she was pressured by the black psychologist who called me a white supremacist not to give me a platform and that I should be canceled. Setting aside the smear campaign against me, what does this tell us about the state of psychoanalysis today? Given I'm virtually impervious to such insults at this point, I thought I would offer my contrapuntal views on a debate that was not destined to take place. To quote the words of Edward Said in Orientalism, I hope to, quote, introduce a longer sequence of thought and analysis to replace the short bursts of polemical, thought-stopping fury that so imprison us in labels and antagonistic debate, whose goal is a belligerent collective identity rather than understanding and intellectual exchange, end quote. Said obviously had in mind the deleterious effects of identity politics so prevalent today. Identity politics. Identitarian rhetoric is everywhere, and no less visible in psychoanalysis, where calls to decolonize the field, whatever that means, abound unfettered, yet are met with silence from the majority who have caved to the propaganda of small factions who have profited from vociferously brandishing their identity politics through social injustice narratives of oppression at the hands of Whitey. Here the arbitrary white guy becomes the whipping boy for all of society's ills and woes, the new patsy. Brainwashed into thinking that all of modern culture is governed by white supremacy, white people have generically become targets of group bullying, who are called out and flogged by proxy by critical social justice warriors. Unfairly blamed for the actions of others, Whitey is supposed to humbly bend over and receive fine paddling, where, "Thank you, sir, may I have another?" becomes the expected response to such hazing, the new imposed social contract. Identitarianism is so rampant that it now becomes fashionable to carry an identity flag, where your color, your race, gender, or whatever hybrid distinctiveness you happen to be signals who you are to the world, not least the antipathy for a cisgendered, heterosexual, married, white, racist male one might happen to be. We are now living in an age of lunacy, where anyone can take offense to someone's identity simply based on being different. We may be reminded of Nietzsche's notion of ressentiment, which is the deep sense of hostility and rage directed toward an identified cause of one's frustration and malaise that is to be blamed for the seeds of one's own suffering. Such animus is intensified when the perceived cause of one's malady is not acknowledged as such by the accused, and as such is disavowed or dismissed because they refuse to accept culpability and guilt for others' own feelings of inadequacy or jealousy that is projected onto the denied cause of their discontent. In other words, there's always someone else to condemn and whip who is the cause of one's anguish. But here is the psychoanalytic twist. The other's moral stance is then used as an excuse to justify one's subordinate status and envy by attributing evil to them. Hence a reversal or turning on the object, when objectively they have done nothing to them, only what they represent or symbolize in their own emotional economy. In this case, anyone who's white, like the rest of us, should be roughhoused. Here Whitey becomes the means of justifying their envy and feelings of disadvantage that defensively prevents them from overcoming their own limitations and plight. A reassignment of pain onto the external scapegoat, the beast that needs to be sacrificed for the sake of the sufferer, the illusory enemy that should be burned while proclaiming, "I am deficient because of you." The external evil other now becomes the cause of all suffering. This becomes the new morality, masquerading as authentic truth where no culpability lies in the individual, for the white mass has stripped that capacity away simply because they lack privilege. In other words, the resentful have a need to erect a white nemesis that becomes the reason why they cannot flourish, based on the false epistemology that they remain enslaved by colonial desires who dominate and oppress them today, not simply during past historical times of slavery, to which they naturally feel aggrieved. Here all notions of choice, freedom, and agency are denied and attributed to the evil imperialist white other, the dominant social order, who victimizes them, where responsibility for their own lives is suspended. Yes, I am sure Nietzsche would turn over in his grave if he could see the modern-day lack of accountability people voluntarily relinquish over their own existence. Contemporary identity politics, from the cultural left to the populist right, seem to be fixated on a cult of victimhood, where the logic of ressentiment demands that the dominant social order pay, figuratively and literally, for all historical damages. "You owe me" is the new chant. This is clearly a form of illiberal ideology rooted in the relativism of postmodern politics, where the zenith of seething resentment has blown the identity whistle, yet it obfuscates the real issue of class struggle. Those overly invested in their own woundedness and grievances, rapt to hold all others responsible, will never move beyond their narrow self-interests, hell-bent on deriding some white signpost from days of yore. Whitey is the new signifier of suffering, responsible for the barred subject, the one who creates the zone of non-being, hence the cause of the world's problems. Where is accountability in this so-called narrative? The public use of resentment calls a certain self-satisfaction that comes with identity politics that derives its currency on the virtue of airing negativity. Even though the wretched of the earth refuse to be interpellated, in contemporary American society there is no dearth of contempt for Whitey, even though they claim to pine for the recognition of the dominant social forces that could liberate them from their agony and decay. But they're not after inclusion in liberal democracy, only the abolition of so-called racist capitalist operations and their normative compliance. But where does this fantasy leave us? As if we're going to abandon our globalized capitalist framework we are situated in, live and work, for some transcendental utopian scheme of total equality for all people throughout the world? Is this not an illusion? Improving equal opportunities structurally, systemically, and institutionally for all of society is not the same as the unrealistic claims of dismantling capitalism, as if there's anything such as pure capitalism that's unconstrained anyway, given there will always be governmental regulation and societal practices that compete for implementation the demos and the polis demand in any given country. Like we're all going to sit around, hold hands, and sing Kumbaya while some big daddy will take care of all our material, social, and psychological needs, itself the delusion of divinity. Doesn't this seem to strike you as an adolescent charade of acting out one's self-proclaimed moral superiority of what the best society should be based on bankrupt ideals no one can live up to, let alone actualize? On culture wars. We are well into a societal imbroglio dubbed the culture wars. But what is this exactly? Since the racial reckoning, and especially after the public murder of George Floyd, progressive left enthusiasts, including the Black Lives Matter activism movement, has determined that so-called white supremacy, including structural, systemic, and institutional racism, lies at the heart of everything. After worldwide anti-racism protests sparked riots, looting, and shooting occurred, critical social justice avengers called on to defund the police in many large U.S. cities from Minneapolis to Portland, Seattle, Austin, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and New York City, just to name a few. It should be no surprise to anyone that when police presence is withdrawn from communities, crime only goes up, and often the people most affected are disenfranchised groups, marginalized minorities, people of color, the vulnerable, and those who are poor. After such lunacy invited a spike in crime, many of those same police departments are now refunding their law enforcement in order to rein in illegality and keep their communities safe. First of all, there's a big difference between those who believe that their race is inherently superior to other races and should have control over them, let alone advocate hate simply based on the color of one's skin, versus those who consciously or unconsciously harbor racist resentments or attitudes directed toward alterity. Most decent people keep such thoughts to themselves, along with a degree of shame, guilt, or humility, as it's not the better angels of our nature. But it is quite a different matter to accuse an entire population of being white supremacists by virtue of simply being white. The notion that contemporary society is governed by white supremacy is a progressive ideology that has no basis in fact. It is an offensive myth based in hysterical hype wielding a brazen political agenda. Just because a person is of Caucasian background does not make them a white supremacist, let alone a member of the KKK or the Proud Boys. The very notion that just because you're white, you are indicted of feeling superior to others based on your skin color, and furthermore want to dominate and oppress them a fortiori, is not only ludicrous, it is itself obscene. Moreover, it's a racist insult based on sophistry designed to gaslight the public who wants to blame Whitey for the historical sins of slavery. Racism is a fact in every society, and there's no need to deny or disavow its ubiquity. Psychoanalysis has long showed that prejudice is part of human nature, whether we like it or not. Nobody gets a free pass. Anyone claiming not to harbor racist thoughts or dispositions is simply lying, posturing, or wanting to appear morally virtuous. Give me an hour in a clinical interview with anyone and I will prove my point. Do I have any takers? Everyone is racist. It's just a matter of degree. But when the more egregious forms of racism prevail, it hurts all of society. The question becomes, what do we do about it? What does, quote, dismantling systemic racism really mean? Do we mean fighting racism? Well, that sounds reasonable and is an ethical thing to do. But do we really believe that every institution in society, from municipal to state and federal government, public corporations and private industry, is racist to the core? That there is a consolidated conspiracy by white people everywhere, acting cryptically yet in earnest to keeping the other down? Given that immigration, multiculturalism, and the intersectionality of race and ethnicity are infused in the very fabric of North American and British societies, this would mean, by logical definition, that all these non-Anglo citizens are also directly and indirectly participating in a racist plot to subjugate alterity, hence themselves. If this is indeed the case, why would they conspire to harm their own people in self-interest at the same time by supporting and actively engaging in a so-called racist system engineered by global society they directly participate in and contribute to? What logical rationale would account for this? To say that social collectives are unconscious of their behavior, do not consider their lives or actions as participating in a racist system they themselves sustain, are generally unreflective, powerless, subjugated, programmed, or simply conditioned sheep in the meadow, is the most condescending exoneration. We should not treat grown adults like children and assume they should be sheltered from truth and reality, are too stupid, lack the ability to think critically, and patronizingly need to be told what to think and how to act. I can think of no greater form of infantilization. So then what motivates their complicity? Is it perhaps as simple as everyone lives together in our multicultural world of diversity, where we are more or less interdependent on one another due to globalization, geopolitical cooperation, international trade, and collective capitalism? So how could this globalized macro system of economic trade and intercontinental collaboration be inherently systemically racist when peoples of the global majority are not Caucasian? Predictably, the mantra goes, but it's because the slave-holding whitey has colonized them, itself an affront to their agency. The racist trope. Now the controversial new rave is about critical race theory. Once an obscure legal theory has now been annexed by popular culture, where white babies are supposedly born racist immediately after coming out of the womb. Public schools that attempted to implement race essentialist curriculums and started to get kindergarten children to think of themselves as white perma-oppressors and black perma-victims were bound to shock, especially when school districts and the media blundered by trying to deny, deceive, and cover up that any of this was happening at all. No wonder why stop woke laws, don't say gay bills, and book banning in school curriculums came out of the conservative woodwork. Legislation deliberately designed where you can't talk about race, gender, or sex, period. Itself a retrograde attempt to censor free speech and rebuff important social issues that need serious discussion. But the question still becomes, when is it appropriate to introduce such ideas to children? Now even the sciences are under attack, where STEM subjects like technology, engineering, medicine, and math are considered to be hotbeds of racism and misogyny. Most ridiculous is the premise that mathematics is historically based in white supremacy, despite the fact that major advances in the field have come from Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, Chinese, Indians, and Arabs, and whatever ethnicity a mathematician is, they seem to get similar results. From the American Medical Association to prestigious journals such as Scientific America and Nature, virtually every science organization has become woke, claiming that systemic racism and white supremacy has infiltrated all corners of the globe. Leaders in science and medicine are now apologizing for their own race in creating social injustice and structural forms of oppression. Even more absurd is the notion that professionalism, perfectionism, objectivity, and a sense of urgency are labeled white supremacist values and traits, as if these characteristics do not appear cross-culturally all over the world and from every shade under the rainbow. Tell that to your employer when you lose your job. Oh yeah, it's because he's black. Who could support such a daft distortion of reality? But if you were to question any of this dogma in academia, social media, or popular culture, you'll be labeled a racist, a fine sophist tactic to spring on any critical reflection on a topic in order to shut it down. Request to explain yourself, to ask for clarity of definitions, demonstrations of proof, let alone challenging the self-predicating circularity of arguments, is enough to muffle any competing narrative passed off as bigoted offense. But does any of this scapegoating, blaming, or hating Whitey help? Does it move us toward a more just and equitable society where people can engage these complex social issues in civil discourse and humanitarian fashions with a unified egalitarian goal in mind? Or does it simply keep divisions in place that actually harm racialized groups from achieving more equity simply because they want to pillory or lynch their imaginary white master? Casting false and emotionally reactionary manufactured accusations of oppression, victimization, colonization, imperialism against one's neighbor will only get people's backs up, discredit the legitimacy of any social justice initiatives that are offered in good faith, and ensure that rage, entitlement, and condemnation of white alterity will bring no desire to sit down at the table to find viable solutions. This type of crass activism is simply a sure way to shoot each other in the foot. The crucial moment in any social movement is when ideology has become a hegemony. The new fetishized ideological object of mass consumption is white supremacy. Now people are being called a white supremacist for simply being white. Oh, I forgot. Only whites can be racist. Didn't you know that? Where self-flagellation, conscripted apologies, embarrassing confessionals over white privilege, guilt inducement, and shaming have all become public spectator sports. Poor and working class whites derived no benefits from slavery, as they certainly had no cotton plantations in the American South or the Caribbean, only the rich elite. And yet they get tarred with the same brush even today. What this hyperbolic, unmeasured, free-for-all embellishment really has to do with is animus over power relations and class inequalities that disproportionately advantage some groups over others. Yet they are exploited within any given social milieu, regardless of what color, gender, or country you happen to be from. And of course, anyone who's decrying privilege simply wants it for themselves, as envy is staring us plainly in the face. This is not meant to diminish the historical effects of slavery and the transgenerational transmission of trauma on the lives of its descendants. Living in the aftermath of humanity's barbaric practices, cultural genocide has traumatized many peoples, indigenous or not, including those displaced through the African diaspora, or more contemporaneously, as we live in the shadow of the Holocaust. But when we focus exclusively on one people's plight, we tend to forget others. Long before the transatlantic slave trade that dominates contemporary discourse in the United States, especially since the New York Times 1619 project that reframes history and places slavery at the center of American society, itself a fallacious exaggeration of history, as if every English settler and their descendants were slave owners. We must not forget that much of civilization was built on slave labor. The Indian Ocean slave trade goes back to at least 2500 before the Common Era, involving ancient Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, the Indian subcontinent, and the Arab world, such as Persians, who all traded slaves across the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and sub-Saharan Africa that preceded European colonialism. What is further appalling is that modern slavery and human trafficking in the forms of forced labor, criminal and sexual exploitation, forced marriage without consent, and domestic servitude affect over 40 million people throughout the globe today. Modern slavery occurs in every region of the world, with the highest prevalent rates in Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and the Arab states. Victims are often vulnerable persons enslaved and trafficked due to coercion, violence, and fraud, where they're kept in forced captivity and work in abominable conditions, controlled physically, economically, and psychologically through fear, threats, dependency, and debt bondage, where an estimated 1 in 4 victims are children. The Americentric obsession with race and anti-racism activism tends to get more media attention than fighting ongoing racism in Africa perpetrated by other African blacks who discriminate against others and perpetrate murder based on ethnic differences, tribal rivalry, and darker shades of skin color. It's further worth noting that skin color hierarchies existed in ancient cultures some 10,000 years before European classification systems and colonization, most conspicuously in India, where the caste system, based primarily on differences in color hues, is still practiced today. This means that various values attached to skin color were established independently of white imperialist countries by indigenous peoples within their own intergroup identifications tied to identity politics and power imbalances. Of course, none of this is simple, but the rhetoric around race and color schemes such as white, brown, black, or mixed is designed to plant wedges, point fingers, and make demands of others that they can do very little about. We're all racialized when social discourse wants to place us in a color box we don't choose to adopt. As I have said elsewhere, this is the new racism, where diversity politics is the new sham. It's also dangerous because everyone will be pitted against each other based on visible difference alone. There is no such thing as whiteness. Take the empirical fact that white is not an ethnicity at all, and yet it often gets treated as if it were the case. It's not. There's no empirical evidence for this postmodern ruse. There are people with ancestry from all sorts of northern climates with a lighter scale of view on the color spectrum, but the idea of whiteness did not emerge until the colonial era. It came about as a categorization scheme often applied to morphological distinctions across population groups and class differences that has no basis in biology whatsoever. Science shows there's no biology of race. The concept of race is a social construction. According to credible science, we're nearly identical with regards to our genetic makeup as a human species, with more in-group variations than between populations. And there is no genetic markers associated with whiteness. You could come from all sorts of geographic places and get lumped into that category based on skin color alone due to random bias. How can this magically appear on one's genome at arbitrary points in history, such as when poor Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Hunger, who were in no position to dominate anyone, yet were met with extreme prejudice, including no Irish need apply when searching for work. But then somehow their descendants miraculously acquired white genes. It's all hoopla. I think such inane posturing of pitting whites as colonial oppressors against all other so-called races simply gets everyone worked up, while taking serious attention away from real racist practices like redlining, loan discrimination, racial profiling, mass incarcerations, etc., that continue unabated. Here, racial hyperbole as negation of whites is very counterproductive to responsible activism. In fact, insistence on racialization of others that pits difference against difference reinforces divisions and polarities that make racism even more entrenched. Psychoanalysis calls this splitting. This is why the case for color blindness is metaphorical and not literal. It is more about acknowledging difference without succumbing to essentializing people based on their race or skin color alone. This noble social practice of unspoken acknowledgement of visual difference is based on a generic ethic of mutual decency, where the virtues of civility, respect, dignity, and simply being interpersonally courteous is preferred by all. Who in their right mind would prefer to generate immediate antagonism based on racial or ethnic difference unless they wanted to provoke a fight and had an axe to grind? We don't need that kind of hate. We also don't need to be forced to identify people based on such differences, as it only stirs up antipathy and provokes resentment. Critical social justice activities alienate others and sabotage their own cause when all they do is blame someone else or some other group for their misery. All that does is lead to an infinite regress, where some other person, group, event, or entity is causally responsible for why one is who they are today. This is a pathetic excuse for abnegating existential responsibility to actualize one's potential and transcend the facticity of historical oppression by others. Because anyone who claims to be a perennial victim of history is a slave to history, itself a sorry subjugation to nihilism, which they wish to project onto others. This attitude also becomes low-hanging fruit for the far right to exploit. Victimization culture likely fortifies a total indifference to alterity because of such strong rhetoric, guilt inducement, scapegoating, and the flagrant trafficking in identitarian language or the discourse of othering that is designed to distance their counterparts, stoke emotions and resentment, and simply close the door to meaningful dialogue. Because we are living in an era of lunacy, where anyone is licensed to take offense at anyone who is different than them, we should take pause to note that the situation could turn instantly on a dime. Who then will become the accuser and who the oppressor? Thank you for listening.